Hi, good afternoon to all of you. So, welcome to this special initiative of Unacademy. As part of this, our YouTube classes, yesterday we have seen the basic aspects of Indian economy. Now, today, let us look at the one of the important parts of Indian economy, fiscal policy. Today, let us look at fiscal policy. What are we going to discuss as part of this fiscal policy? This is what we will be discussing as part of fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy and what are the objectives of fiscal policy? What are the different types of fiscal policy? What are the different instruments of fiscal policy? And as part of this, we will be looking at revenue policy, expenditure policy, budgets, different types of deficits, and also India's fiscal policy in recent times. So this is what we shall be looking at as part of today's discussions. I don't have to tell you about the importance of this topic from the examination point of view, because very good number of questions are asked from fiscal policy in your prelims. On an average, if they are asking around say 10-12 questions from prelims, at least half the questions are from fiscal policy only. And most of the questions you must remember are asked, most of the questions are what we call analytical questions. Basically, they would like to test your analytical knowledge of the fiscal policy, the practical applications of fiscal policy. As I proceed with this topic, you are free to ask your doubts. You can ask your doubts in our Telegram, in our YouTube here, and then I will try to clarify those doubts. So what exactly is fiscal policy? As the name itself indicates, fisc means finances. Fiscal policy is the financial policy of the government. As we know, no organization, no government can survive without finances. So the governments continuously are in need of revenues so that they can spend their expenditure. In a democratic polity, political parties will have to work for the welfare of people, because of which they have to spend a lot of money. And to spend that money, they also need revenues. So fiscal policy deals with what we call the revenues and expenditures of the government. Fisc means finance. Finances include both revenues and expenditure. What are the objectives of fiscal policy? Very simple. What are the objectives of this fiscal policy? Very simple. The objectives of fiscal policy are to ensure rapid economic growth, to ensure industrialization, infrastructure development, then self-sustenance, what we call it as Atmanirbhar, then to bring about rapid economic transformation of the society, to remove inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth, and to improve infrastructure, and also to promote our foreign trade. These are all the objectives of fiscal policy. All these are everything from growth to development. Everything is a part of the objectives of fiscal policy. Then, proceeding further, how these objectives are achieved and what are the different types of fiscal policy, this is what we have to look at. Normally, we say that there are two different types of fiscal policy. What are they? Expansionary fiscal policy, contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. As the name itself indicates, in case of expansionary fiscal policy, the objective is to expand the scope of economic activity. To expand the scope of economic activity. How? How does the government expand the scope of economic activity? With the help of its revenue and expenditure policies. With the help of its revenue and expenditure policies. What are those things? We will look at those things as we proceed also with these aspects. And mostly this expansionary fiscal policy is followed during the times of recession and depression. When economic activity is not going forward, when private sector is not willing to invest, when there is a negative sentiment in the markets, that is when the government will step in, try to rectify the market inadequacies and boost economic activity with the help of what we call expansionary fiscal policy. So if you look at it, this is what the government of India is planning to do as part of the present process of overcoming the recession and depression, recession caused by corona crisis. Then what about contractionary fiscal policy? This contractionary fiscal policy is followed during the times of boom in economic activities. It is followed during the times of overheating of economy. Please remember, these questions were asked in your prelims in economy. This contractionary fiscal policy is followed when there is overheating of economy, when the expectations are running very high, the prices are skyrocketing, stock markets are going up like anything. That is when the government has to tamper the expectations. That is when the government has to bring back the situation to normalcy. That is when they follow contractionary fiscal policy. So, how does the government achieve the objectives of this contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy? What will the government do in case of this expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy? That is where we say instrument of fiscal policy. What are the instruments of this fiscal policy? As we have mentioned earlier, first one is revenue policy, second one is expenditure policy. The government tries to achieve the objectives of this fiscal policy with the help of what we call revenue policy and expenditure policy. It tries to achieve the objectives. What is this revenue policy and what is expenditure policy? What kind of policies the government has followed? Why those policies have not been successful? And what can the government do is what we will look at as part of analysis today itself. Right? So, when it comes to revenue policy of the government, what should be the ideal objective of the government in terms of the revenue policy of the government? Ideally, the government has to maximize its revenues. It has to maximize its revenue potential. Why? Because the government needs money to be spent on various aspects. Right? The government needs money. The government needs money to be spent on various activities of the economy. That is the reason why the government has to maximize its revenues. But what the government must make sure is that when it is maximizing its revenues, it should make sure that it is not impacting adversely the poorest sections of society. Poor people, as Kautilya speaks about in Arthashastra, the government should take the revenue from the people, the taxes should be collected from the people in such a manner that the way honeybee sucks honey from the flowers, in a very, very easy, simple, completely, unpainful manner. It should not be causing any kind of pain to the person who is paying those taxes. That is what we say. So when it comes to the revenues of the government, we broadly divided the revenues of the government into two categories. Please remember, all these questions were asked in our list. They are divided into two categories. What are they? Revenue receipts and capital receipts of the government. Revenue receipts and capital receipts of the government. What are these revenue receipts? revenue receipts are what we call them as recurring revenues of the government. The government keeps on getting these revenues every year. For example, take the case of taxes. The taxes that we pay, direct taxes and indirect taxes. We have to pay these taxes all the time. For example, I am paying income tax for the last, say, 15 years, 20 years. Can I say that let me take tax holiday for around 10 years so that I don't have to pay any income tax for those 10 years? Obviously not. This is what we say. What we say is that there are two things in life which we cannot avoid once we take birth. One is death, second one is taxes. And if you don't pay taxes, government will make sure that you will die also. Right? So this is why these taxes are what we call recurring receipts of the government. The government keeps on getting them every year. It keeps on getting them. Whenever you go and buy something from the market, you are paying taxes. Today, you have purchased, you went to a restaurant, there you have to pay GST. Tomorrow, you go to the same restaurant. Can you say that yesterday I have paid my GST, so today I will not pay my GST? Obviously not. You cannot say those things. They have to be paid, recurring in nature. What are the other revenue receipts of the government apart from tax revenues? What are the other recurring receipts of the government? Revenue receipts of the government apart from taxes. The dividends paid by public sector enterprises. Public sector enterprises they sometimes get the profits also. So when they get profits, they pay dividend to the government. Government is the owner of these public sector enterprises. The dividends that are paid by the public sector enterprise, they are recurring in nature. Then what are the other revenue receipts of the government? The interest paid by the state governments for the loans they have taken from the center. Central government gives loans to the state governments. When the state governments repay those loans, they have to pay the rate of interest also to the central government. This is another important revenue receipt of the government. It is recurring in nature. Then what are the other revenue receipts? The court fee and the fines that the people will pay. For example, you are crossing a red light, challan will be issued. It is recurring in nature. As many times you cross the challan, you cross the red light, you have to pay the challan. These are all recurring in nature. These are all recurring in nature. This is what we say revenue receipts of the government. On the other hand, we talk about capital receipts of the government. What are these capital receipts of the government? These capital receipts of the government are what we call them as one-time receipts of the government. That means the government will get this money only one time. They are not recurring in nature. What are the examples of these capital receipts? Take the case of sale of assets by the government. Sale of assets by the government. Government is selling land. Government is selling any other assets. It is only one-time receipt. Can the government sell the same asset again and again and again? Obviously not. Once it is sold, it is sold. It is a capital receipt. Next, take the case of the disinvestment proceeds. For example, in this year's budget, the government is expected to raise almost around 1.75 lakh crores of rupees through disinvestment. Can they get the same amount of money next year by disinvesting the same shares? Obviously not. Next year they will have to disinvest from other public sector enterprises. Disinvestment proceeds. Then loan repaid by the state governments. As I said, the state governments are taking loans from the central government. They not only pay the interest, they also pay the principal amount also. And this is also a one-time payment for the government. Then loans taken by the government, loans taken by the central government. These loans taken by the government, they are part of receipts, they are not revenues, because the government will have to repay the amount again later. The loans taken by the central government. Then aid received by the government. Nowadays India has rejected any kind of aid, but earlier we used to take a lot of aid from other countries. This is also part of what we call the capital receipts of the government. Then sale of spectrum. Sale of spectrum. This sale of spectrum is also a sale of spectrum and other natural resources of the government. They are also part of what we call capital receipts of the government, because you are selling only for once, right? So this is what we say the capital receipts of the government. Revenues. Another division of revenues that we have is tax revenues and non-tax revenues. The revenues of the government. Another division is what we call tax revenues and non-tax revenues. Again, the questions were asked here in your prelims examination. What are these tax revenues and what are these non-tax revenues? What is the basic difference here? In case of tax revenues, they are unidirectional transfers from citizens to the state. There is no reciprocity involved in tax revenues. There is no reciprocity involved in tax revenues. That means, since I am paying income tax, can I tell the government that please construct a road in front of my house? Obviously not. I cannot tell the government that please construct a road in front of my construct a road in front of my house with the amount of tax I am paying. They are unidirectional transfers. There is no reciprocity involved. Again, this is what UPSC will be asking in our prelims also. Which among the following are true about tax revenues? There is no reciprocity involved. There are unidirectional transfers from the government, from the people to the government. Right? Whereas non-tax revenues are unconditional transfers. The government will get those revenues only when they provide, only when they provide certain services to the people. Whereas in case of tax revenues, we call them as unconditional transfers. You have to pay the amount of money to the government, irrespective of what the government can do for you or not, irrespective of what the government will do for you or not. Here you can go through this one. Sometime back in our ethics paper also the question was asked. How do civilians can show their patriotism? Because we know army men can show their patriotism by sacrificing their life for the sake of the country, by fighting war with the enemies. As a civilian, how do you show your patriotism? You can show your patriotism by paying your taxes. Because you don't get anything from the government in return. That means you are also sacrificing a part of your income, livelihood, money for the sake of the country. You are no less patriotic than the army men who are sacrificing their life. Right? So, coming back here, proceeding further, these tax revenues are again further divided into two categories: direct taxes and indirect taxes. They are further divided into two categories: direct and indirect taxes. What are these direct taxes and what are these indirect taxes? Let us see. So, when we talk about direct taxes in economics, what we say is that when it comes to direct taxes, we say that the tax incidence and tax impact will be on the same person. That is how we define direct taxes in economics. That means taxes will have to be paid by the person on whom they are imposed. tax incidence means, on the person whom the taxes are imposed. Tax impact of the taxes will be only on the same person. That means the tax burden cannot be shared with others. You cannot share your tax burden. For example, take the case of income tax. I am earning income. Can I ask any other person on my behalf to pay income tax? Obviously, no. This is what we say direct tax. Examples I say income tax, wealth tax, capital gains tax, corporation tax. These are all what we call tax, direct taxes. And what do we say about these direct taxes? This is very important. We say that these direct taxes are progressive in nature. They are progressive in nature. What do we mean by they are progressive in nature? It means that as our income increases, the amount of tax that we have to pay also increases. That means rich people will have to pay more taxes. As you become more rich, you will be paying more taxes. Right? That is what we say progressive in nature. On the other hand, poor people who do not have any income do not have to pay any tax also. That is the reason why, as we proceed, we look at this and say that if you want to know whether the taxation policy of the government is good or not, the simple parameter is just to see the composition of direct taxes in overall tax revenues of the government. If the composition of direct taxes in overall tax revenues of the government is very high, it means that the government is following what is called progressive taxation policy. On the other hand, we have indirect taxes. What are these indirect taxes? These indirect taxes, from economic perspective, what we say is that in case of the indirect taxes, the tax incidence and the tax impact will be on different people. Taxes are imposed on producers and they are paid by the consumers. For example, take the case of GST, Goods and Services Tax, an indirect tax. The taxes are imposed on the producers by the government, GST, and they are paid by the final consumer in the form of increasing the prices. When yesterday, if you remember, we have discussed about the difference between cost of production and the price. The price of a commodity includes cost of production plus taxes. So the taxes are transferred to the final consumers. That is what we call indirect taxes. Right? The taxes are paid by you only, but indirectly. In case of direct taxes, you are paying directly. And one more thing that we have to remember about indirect taxes is that these indirect taxes are highly regressive in nature. They are highly regressive in nature. Why? Why do we say that? Because a person living below poverty line will be paying the same amount of tax on petrol and diesel like that of Mukesh Ambani. They are highly regressive in nature. Why? Because irrespective of your income, irrespective of your economic status, irrespective of your standing in the society, everyone will be paying the same amount of tax. And this is the reason why they are regressive in nature. What are the examples of these indirect taxes? Customs duties, excise duties. Then, of course, the most important one, this is GST. What the government of India has done, they have taken all those indirect taxes and they have subsumed it into what we call goods and services tax. These are all indirect taxes, right? So, as we have mentioned, these indirect taxes are highly regressive in nature. That is the reason why, as we have mentioned, if the government wants to get maximum amount of revenues through taxes, it should make sure that it is getting maximum amount of revenues only from direct taxes, so that rich people are paying more taxes. And if you look at India, in the last few years, what we can see is that our taxation policy has become highly regressive in nature, especially with the petroleum and diesel prices. The government is imposing huge amount of taxes on petroleum and diesel products, which are regressive, which are indirect, and which impact the poor people more than anyone else. Why? Because with the increase in these taxes, automatically the prices will go up. When the prices go up, what happens? People would be much more poorer. Their real incomes will be coming down. Their money income can be the same, but the real incomes will be coming down, which makes them much more poorer. That is the reason why we said that in the last 1.5 years of Corona crisis, it is said that according to one estimate, 235 million people went below poverty line in India. And the government kept on increasing the prices of petroleum and diesel products. They are highly regressive in nature. Ultimately, we say that the best taxation policy of the government is the one wherein the government gets maximum revenues from direct taxes and very less amount of revenue from indirect taxes. Right? Proceeding further, we will look at why the people don't pay taxes, what can be the reform that can be implemented, all those things we can see, because as I said, UPSC is focusing more on analysis. It is focusing more on analysis, as we said. So we should know about all those things also. So coming back here, right? Coming back here, what we have seen is the revenues of the government. What we are looking at is the revenues of the government. Now proceeding further, we have seen the tax revenues of the government. Let us look at what we call the non-tax revenues of the government. Non-tax revenues of the government. As we have said, in case of non-tax revenues, they are conditional transfers. That means the government will get those revenues only when it performs certain tasks. So what are the non-tax receipts of the government? Let us try to look at what are those non-tax receipts of the government. Let us see what are those non-tax receipts of the government. So when you look at this non-tax receipts of the government, for example, the most important revenues are what we call user charges. Especially in this age of liberalization, privatization, globalization, one of the most important revenues of the government through non-tax sources is user charges. The government will be providing so many services to the people. These services are provided by various public sector enterprises, and the government will be getting a lot of money through them. The government will be getting a lot of money through them. User charges. Government will be providing education, health, infrastructure, then electricity, transportation, communication. These are all the services provided by the government for which it will charge money from the people. One of the most important sources of non-tax revenues. Then what are the other non-tax revenues of the government? Next one is, as we discussed earlier, the interest paid by the state governments for the loans they have taken from the government. Then the principal paid by the state governments for the loans they have taken from the government. Then the sale of assets by the government, then disinvestment proceeds, then the fines and court fee collected by the government, then the loans received by the government, and also the aid the government gets. These are all what we call non-tax revenues. Now, let me here bring in a little bit of analysis here. If you look at during the Corona crisis, if you go back to the last year when the lockdown was imposed for 2 months, what happened? Almost every state government in India, their finances had completely collapsed. Every state government finances collapsed. Why? What is the reason why their finances have collapsed completely during that Corona crisis? Why? Because most of the state governments are dependent only on tax revenues. They simply do not have any non-tax revenues. They can get these tax revenues. You must remember, the state governments can get these tax revenues only when there is economic activity in the country. And this economic activity has come to a standstill for those 2 months of complete lockdown, because of which what happened? They had become bankrupt. And one of the most dangerous trends in public finances in the recent times is excessive dependence of state governments as well as central government on these tax revenues, which is not a very healthy sign of functioning of an economic system. The government simply have forgotten to raise revenues through non-tax receipts, because public sector enterprises nowhere else are performing well, because the government are not looking at getting revenues from the people through providing other services to the people. Most of it is being right now privatized. The services are privatized. When the services are privatized, the income stream from the government will also be stopped. This is one of the dangerous trends in public finance that we see after liberalization, privatization and globalization, which has had a major adverse impact on the revenues of the government also. So this is what we say about the revenues of the government, and this is what we say about revenue policy of the government. Ideally, as I have mentioned, the government should depend more on non-tax receipts to increase its revenues. Ideally, in tax revenues, the government should depend more on direct taxes to maximize its revenues. In reality, if you look at India, both the central government as well as state governments, what are they doing right now? They are dependent more on indirect taxes. They are dependent more on indirect taxes. That is the reason why no state government is willing to reduce GST. That is the reason why central government is also maintaining criminal silence on this petroleum products. Because both the central and states have failed to learn the art of raising revenues through non-tax sources. The only non-tax sources that they can think of is borrowing. If you happen to see the newspapers in recent times, in the first 65 years of our independence, we have borrowed around 46 lakh crores of rupees. Total public debt. After BJP NDA came to power, in the last 7 years, they have borrowed 1 crore 16 lakh crores of rupees. Crores and crores of rupees. You can imagine how the borrowings have expanded. 116 lakh crores of rupees of borrowings that the government has made in the last 7 years. The present government. 116 lakh crores. Can you imagine? Such a huge amount. 116 lakh crores. Why? Because, as I mentioned, governments simply have forgotten the art of raising revenues through other non-tax sources. This is where the problem is. Right? This is about the revenue policy of the government. Proceeding further, let us look at expenditures policy of the government. As you have mentioned, there are two instruments of fiscal policy. One is revenue policy, second one is expenditure policy. Let us see the expenditure of the government. And when you have any kind of doubts, I just said you please write your doubts here. I can see them and I will try to answer them also. Right? You can raise your questions here. Come to the expenditure policy of the government. Let us look at the expenditure policy of the government. So, when we talk about the expenditure policy of the government, what we say is that broadly, the expenditure of the government can be divided into two categories. One is revenue expenditure, other one is capital expenditure. Like we have divided it into revenue receipts and capital receipts. When it comes to expenditure, we are talking about revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Please remember, lots of questions in your prelims are asked from only these things: revenue expenditure, capital expenditure, revenue receipts and capital receipts. So what is this revenue expenditure and what is this capital expenditure? Right? Let us try to look at that. Revenue expenditure is what we call it as a recurring expenditure. That means you have to spend that money all the time. It is also called consumption expenditure. That means the money is spent for our own consumption. It is also called maintenance expenditure because the money is spent to maintain assets. And finally, it is unproductive expenditure because it does not add anything to the economic system. It does not create any assets. It does not add anything to the economic system. If I talk about revenue expenditure theoretically like this, you will get confused and you will also get bored. So let us try to understand revenue expenditure from the perspective of the components of revenue expenditure. What are the components of revenue expenditure? Please remember, as I said, these questions were asked in your prelims repeatedly. What are the major components of revenue expenditure? First and foremost, take the case of interest payments, which is a major part of our revenue expenditure. Interest payments means the government will be taking loans, and when the government is taking loans, it has to pay the rate of interest also. When this rate of interest is paid by the government, it is nothing but a transfer payment. No assets are created. The money will go from the government to the creditors. It is unproductive. It is recurring. The government will have to pay the rate of interest every month, every year, till the entire loan is repaid. The government will have to pay this rate of interest. And it is unproductive and it is inefficient expenditure, consumption. Next, second important component of revenue expenditure is what we call subsidies. What are these subsidies? Subsidies are called transfer payments. Transfer payments from the government to the citizens. Subsidies are also called negative taxes. In case of taxes, what happens? Money will be transferred from the people to the government. In case of subsidies, it is negative. That is, money will be transferred from the government to the citizens. These subsidies are unproductive expenditure because they are not creating any assets. They are consumption expenditure and they are recurring expenditure. And they are also what we call maintenance expenditure. You are maintaining people. For example, take the case of the subsidy given by the government on rice and wheat. The market price of rice is say 40 rupees. Through PDS, the government is providing the same rice to people living below poverty line for 2 rupees per kilo. So the subsidy here is 38 rupees. 38 rupees will be the subsidy for the government. 38 rupees will be the subsidy for the government. Right? When the government is transferring so much of money to the people, is it creating any assets? Is it providing employment? Is it empowering citizens? Is it resulting in infrastructure? Obviously not. That is the reason why they are revenue expenditure. And these subsidies have to be given all the time. For how long should we give these food subsidies? As long as people are alive, we have to give those subsidies. As long as they are alive. This is what we say. The third component of this revenue expenditure, the third component of revenue expenditure is what we call, the third component of revenue expenditure is this defense expenditure. People believe that this defense expenditure should be part of capital expenditure, but unfortunately, it is not capital expenditure, it is only revenue expenditure. Why do we say that? Because defense, what does the army do? Army is responsible for maintaining our borders, ensuring that there is no external aggression. So, what are the amount of money spent by the government on defense is what is called revenue expenditure, because every year you have to pay that money. You have to maintain army, you have to pay their salaries. Every year, you have to spend that money, and it is not productive in nature. I'll give you an example to explain why this is called revenue expenditure. Why defense expenditure is called revenue expenditure? Why it is unproductive? Immediately after Second World War, Japan was completely demilitarized by United States of America. It was completely demilitarized by United States of America, Japan, and America has provided security umbrella for Japan as part of NATO countries. Japan was not allowed to maintain its army, raise its own army. And what did Japan do? Japan spent all its monies on productive expenditure, creating infrastructure, industry, so on and so forth. Within 30 years, Japan had become a superpower. Whereas India and Pakistan got independence at the same time. And what happened? Both India and Pakistan had spent in the last 75 years or so huge amounts of money on defense expenditure, because of which both these countries are at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to HDI or MDPA or concern. Why? Because why? Because right, right. That is what happens. So that is why the problem is there. That is why we say that India has remained poor only. Because we are diverting all our finances. I will give you one more example here. Since some people are feeling that it is getting bored, let me give you one more example here. During this Corona crisis, the government did not have money to improve health infrastructure. The government did not have money to improve health infrastructure, but the government had spent 40,000 crores of rupees to modernize its navy. Imagine the same amount of money being spent on improving health infrastructure in rural areas. The government has purchased so many Rafale aircrafts by paying thousands of crores of rupees. But the government does not have money to provide basic facilities, to basic minimum facilities to the people in the form of education and health, because all the resources are diverted for this unproductive expenditure. In the 75th year of our independence, when patriotism is running very high, right? Whatever I am saying here might be considered what is called unpatriotic, but the fact is that defense expenditure is what is called revenue expenditure. Next, the last item in revenue expenditure is what is called administrative expenditure. Please remember, I said these questions were asked repeatedly in our prelims. What is this administrative expenditure that we talked about? The amount of money spent by the government on the salaries, pensions, and other administrative expenses of its bureaucracy. Look at these IAS officers or IPS officers. A farmer is producing rice or wheat, an industrialist is producing iron and steel, and right, a doctor is providing health. But what is the productive right? What is the productive way of what is the productivity of a government servant, an IAS officer or IPS officer or IRS officer? Are they producing anything? An IAS officer is responsible for spending the monies of the government. An IPS officer is responsible for maintenance of law and order. An income tax officer is responsible for collecting the tax revenues. They do not contribute anything productively to the economic system. In economics, these things are very much clear. Productivity can be easily quantified, and these people are not contributing anything. They are not contributing to the productive capacity of economy. That is the reason why the amount of money spent by the government on administration is called revenue expenditure. Every month they have to be paid salaries, and after their retirement, every month they have to be paid pensions, everything. All this is what we call revenue expenditure. It is unproductive, it is consumption, it is recurring, and it does not create any assets. It results in high levels of inflation also. On the other hand, we have capital expenditure. What is this capital expenditure? What is this capital expenditure? Capital expenditure is what we call one-time expenditure. It is productive expenditure. It is it results in creation of assets, and it provides employment to the people, and ultimately, it helps in rapid economic growth and development of the country. That is what we call capital expenditure. For example, construction of a road, capital expenditure. Construction of a hospital building, capital expenditure. Construction of a multi-purpose irrigation dam, capital expenditure. And spending money on setting up a public sector enterprise, investment expenditure or capital expenditure. This is what we say. First, it is one-time expenditure, right? Then, it creates assets. You can see the assets there: the roads, the industries, the water tanks, irrigation dams. You can see that one. And they provide employment to the people. Definitely, they provide productive employment to the people. They help in ensuring rapid growth and development of the country, because infrastructure development and industrialization. That is what is necessary for any country. And of course, they help in reducing inflation also. If the government is spending money on agriculture, if the farmer will come out with the product, and once the farmers are coming out with the products, the supply will increase, and with the demand remaining the same, the prices will come down. It helps in reducing our inflation also. That is what we say about capital expenditure. So, again, when we look at the budget of a government, what do we have to look at? When we talk about financial fiscal discipline on the part of the government, what do we say? We say that a government is managing its finances better only when the proportion of capital expenditure is more than that of revenue expenditure in the overall expenditure of the government. This is very, very important. The proportion of capital expenditure should be more than that of revenue expenditure in the overall expenditure of the government. To understand this from the present context, if you look at the 2021-22 budget of the central government, if you look at 2021-22 budget of the central government, what we can see here is that in the overall expenditure of the government, 85% of the expenditure is what we call revenue expenditure. Only 15% of the expenditure is capital expenditure. That is where the problem comes. So, 85% of the money spent by the government of India is on subsidies, is on interest payments, is on its own administration, is on defense. Only 15% of the money is contributing to the economic activity in the long term, in the form of increasing the GDP growth rates, in the form of improving infrastructure, in the form of ensuring a better industrialization, in the form of providing productive employment to the people. And this kind of expenditure on the part of the government can result in the collapse of the governments. The most important reason why Indian economy collapsed in 1991 was because of our inability to ensure what we call fiscal discipline. This is where we talk about this is where we talk about the deficits of the government, revenue deficit, and fiscal deficit and primary deficits. These are the important deficits which we should know as part of fiscal policy. Revenue deficit means revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts of the government. To understand this revenue deficit and fiscal deficit in a very simple manner, because if you look at the definitions, automatically you get confused about all those definitions. That is the reason why let us try to understand these things simply from the perspective of individual, so that we can extend the same logic to the government also. For example, if I am earning say 20,000 rupees per month, what is my revenue expenditure? Amount of money spent by on my food, housing, clothing, then transportation, health, This is what we call revenue expenditure, maintenance expenditure, right? And what will be the capital expenditure? For me, if I am investing my money in the shares, if I am buying a house, if I am buying a land, if I am buying any assets, that is what is called capital expenditure. Now, if I take my 20,000 rupees and if I spend my entire amount of 20,000 rupees only on revenue expenditure, on my food, clothing, health, transportation, and so on and so forth, what happens? At the end of the month, I have to take loan. I'll go to a bank and say that give me loan. Bank gives me loan. Then what happens? I'll have to pay the rate of interest also. How will I repay the loan then? How will I repay the loan? I'll have to repay the loan from my own earnings. But already I'm having revenue deficit. Then what will I do? I will take more loans to repay the old debt. I will take further loans to repay the old debt. Then after some point of time, I would not be in a position to pay the interest also. Forget about the principal. Then one day finally the bank will come and take over all my revenues. Then the bank will say that the bank will ask my office that the salary should be directly credited into the account of the bank only. I will not have anything to eat. I will become bankrupt. Right? This is what happens to me in 1 or 2 years' time if I spend my money like this. Extend the same logic to the government. Government is spending money only on interest payments, on subsidies, popular subsidies, on administrative expenditure, on defense. Then what happens? The government will not have any revenues. How can the government get revenues? The government can get revenues only when people have money. How can the people have money? When can people have money? Only when they have employment. When can the people have employment? Only when they have education and health. Only when there are jobs in the market. When can the jobs be there in the market? Only when there is infrastructure. When can the infrastructure be there? Only when the government spends money on infrastructure. And what is happening here? The government is not spending any money. So there is no economic activity. The economy will be going to recession. People will become poorer. The government keeps on borrowing. What happens after some period of time? After some period of time, when they keeps on borrowing, the government, when it keeps on borrowing to finance its revenue deficits, revenue expenditure, after some point of time, the country's economy will collapse. After some point of time, economy will completely collapse. That is what exactly happened to India in 1991. Now we are celebrating 30 years of economic reforms, as all of us know. We are celebrating these 30 years of economic reforms. And you will be surprised to know that, and you will be surprised to know that, right? You will be surprised to know that India's present economic situation now is much worse than what it was in 1991. The only silver lining, otherwise in the dark horizon, is our economy has become much bigger so that it can face much more shocks also. Otherwise, our economic situation is much worse than what it was, say, in 1991, 30 years ago. Right? I will take up your doubts in the last 5 minutes of our class. Right? You can ask your doubts. I will take up all your doubts in the last 5 minutes of our class. Right? So, coming back here, that is the reason why the government must control its deficits. Revenue deficit is the most dangerous deficit of all. Why? Because what the revenue deficit clearly indicates is that the government is living beyond its means. That means government is spending more amount of money only to maintain itself, only on populist schemes. The government is not spending enough amount of money on infrastructure, industrialization and investment. The country cannot be revived. That is the reason why revenue deficit. Please remember, all these questions will be asked which among the following are the adverse consequences of higher revenue deficits? First, it can result in a situation of debt trap. Second, it results in very high levels of inflation. Why? Because the revenue deficit, revenue expenditure and revenue deficits are unproductive in nature. More money is going into the system without any corresponding increase in the supply of goods and services, because of which the prices will be going up. And the third, the country, I have mentioned, the economic growth will be adversely impacted, because economic growth can take place only with capital expenditure. It can be sustained. And fourth, the country can get into a serious economic crisis like the way the country has experienced in 1991. That is the reason why this revenue deficit is extremely dangerous. Proceeding further, we have another deficit called fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit. What is this fiscal deficit? We have another deficit called fiscal deficit. What is this fiscal deficit? As the name itself indicates, this is the overall deficit of the government. How do we define this fiscal deficit? Very simple definition. Total expenditure, the entire expenditure of the government. If you look at the budget, on the one side you have the revenues, on the other side you have the expenditure. So the overall expenditure of the government minus, this is very important, overall expenditure of the government minus non-debt receipts of the government. Non-debt receipts of the government. This is the definition of what we call fiscal deficit. Overall expenditure of the government minus non-debt receipts of the government. That means, what are the non-debt receipts of the government? Tax revenues and non-tax revenues. Let us assume that overall expenditure of the government is 100 rupees, and the revenues that the government is getting from tax and non-tax revenues, the sources, non-tax sources, is around 70 rupees. So fiscal deficit will be 100 minus 70. That will be 30. And how does the government finance this fiscal deficit? Government finances this fiscal deficit through borrowings. It finances this fiscal deficit through borrowings. This is also what also we call it as the total debt of the government. Right? It finances them through borrowings. The government borrows from both internally as well as externally also. It borrows from both internal as well as external sources. Now proceeding further, why should the government borrow? Right? Why should the government have this deficit financing? What are the reasons why the government will have deficit financing? Please remember, whatever I am telling you here have been asked as questions in your preliminary examination. So what is the reason why the government has to borrow? Why? Because in a developing country like India, the government simply do not have any necessary financial resources to satisfy the needs of each and every person in the country. So this deficit financing is required. It is required because the government has to take care of the safety and security of the country. As you can see, India is surrounded by neighbors who were not really good with the country. What we call them as hostile neighbors. So you cannot lower your guard when it comes to safety and security of the country. Whether we like it or not, we have to spend a lot of money on defense. Then the government has to spend money on infrastructure. The government has to spend money on industrialization. Most importantly, the government has to spend a lot of money on welfare of people. As our Prime Minister has pointed out, the government had provided food grains to 80 crore people during the corona crisis. Where does that money come from? Tax revenues and non-tax revenues are not sufficient. So the government has to spend monies on all these aspects. The government has to spend money on education. It has to spend money on health. It has to spend money on infrastructure. It has to spend money on industrialization. It has to spend money on disaster management. For all these things, it requires money. That is the reason why we need deficit financing. So proceeding further, what we say here is that, getting into the analysis part, what we say here is that what really matters, what we say here is that what really matters is not the quantity of fiscal deficit. Why? Because take countries like China, their public debt is very very high. China's public debt is 280% of its GDP, but its economy will not collapse. So what really matters? Take the case of the United States of America. Its deficits are very very high. It does not really matter. What really matters then is the quality of fiscal deficit. What really matters then is the quality of fiscal deficit. What do you mean by that? It means that what we are doing with those borrowings. If the government is borrowing 100 rupees, how it is spending that money? The quality of fiscal deficit is what that really determines the functioning of the economic system. Why? If the government is borrowing to finance its revenue deficits, it can be extremely dangerous. For example, if you look at today's fiscal deficit of the country, if you look at the total fiscal deficit of the country, almost, if you look at the total fiscal deficit, the government is spending almost more than 80% of its borrowings only to finance revenue expenditure, only to finance revenue deficit, which is extremely difficult situation, sensitive situation. So if the government is borrowing 100 rupees, more than 80 rupees are borrowed by the government to finance unproductive, inefficient revenue expenditure. That is where the country's economic system can be in for a rude shock, because the money spent by the government on this revenue expenditure is unproductive expenditure, consumption expenditure, revenue expenditure, recurring expenditure, and it will not create any assets. More importantly, it results in more inflation also. That is the reason why, as pointed out by Economic Survey all the time, it has spoken about what we call as the golden rule of borrowing. What is the golden rule of borrowing that Economic Survey always talks about? It says that the government should always borrow only to finance capital expenditure. The first and foremost concern in front of the government should always be to finance capital expenditure. Under no circumstances, government should borrow to finance revenue deficit. That is the reason why FRBM legislation has pointed out clearly fiscal responsibility and budget management. It has said that the revenue deficit of the country should be 0, whereas fiscal deficit should be brought down to 3% of our GDP. Unfortunately, we have not made any sincere attempt, I repeat the word, any sincere attempt to realize the objectives of FRBM legislation. Nowadays, when you look at the budget speech of our finance minister, what we can see is that the finance minister does not even talk about the revenue deficit also. Successive finance ministers have stopped talking about revenue deficit also. They have taken it for granted that the revenue deficit will be there, should be there, will always be there, come what may. Even though when the economy is collapsing also. Right? I think we have already crossed the time 1 hour. I think we can stop it here for today. Right? We can stop it here for today. Tomorrow we will continue this fiscal policy, and tomorrow also we will look at monetary policy. I will also try to look at the question that were asked in your prelims examination from these topics also. Right? And you can come out with your doubts tomorrow. I will take up all those doubts. I think one person has asked a doubt here. Let me take up that one. Ananya, she is asking a doubt. the concept of bad bank, which is mentioned in economic survey, earnings of bad bank will be considered as, right? I don't know what is your question here is, will be considered as earnings of bad banks will be considered as revenue expenditure or capital expenditure. Is that what that you are trying to ask? Please make your question a little bit more clear, right? So that I can answer it. So that is more than enough. We can stop it here for today. And tomorrow we will continue at 11 o'clock at the same time, and we will continue with fiscal policy, and we will also look into monetary policy. Till then, take care of yourself. Best of luck.